Hey everyone, Lynn Fairchild Hawks here. Let's talk a little bit about how we can develop meaningful rubrics. So these two questions are what we'll cover in the presentation today. What makes an effective rubric, and how do you design one that will work for your meaningful assessments? So here's some assumptions or essential understandings. Whatever subject area you teach, you can build a course-specific rubric. And if you're doing truly student-centered, project and performance-based learning that requires product and performance standards are more complex than just yes, no, right, wrong answers, then you need a rubric. These take time to develop and evaluate and improve on a regular basis. Year one, you're not done. This is something you will return to and improve as the years go on. And it is a collegial process, and it's also based on experts and colleagues in the field and your students. And we'll talk more about that later. So think about your students and walking in their shoes for a minute. What expectations? That's what they're wondering. What do my teacher want from me? And how do I know that my work is quality? And then I'm sure you're wondering, well, how do I assess the work of students who are gifted? They can perform with greater speed and efficiency. They can yield more accurate, detailed, thorough work. They can go more deeply and broadly with a subject. How am I going to assess their performances and their products? So as we answer these questions together here, the rubric definition is key. Let's make sure we're all on the same page. A rubric is a set of performance standards articulated in one document, and this is a task for a specific population. Now, obviously, the standards and criteria of these performances are linked to skill objectives, which communicate expectations of what a product quality is, or performance or process quality is. And you're going to use those objectives to assess that product performance, etc., and it will identify the work's strengths or weaknesses. And this will give students insight into the performance that they've done. It's not a done deal once you've graded the rubric. This is supposed to be a process that has a cycle of them learning from it and moving on to the next task, building on the foundation here. Keep in mind, too, that rubrics are a public articulation of standards, and they prompt inquiry and further knowledge of a task before it's complete. It's public meaning not only student-facing, but maybe parent-facing and definitely facing to other people, such as other instructors. So a rubric is a measure of stated objectives. It uses a range or a scale that reflects developmental sophistication or degree to which a standard is met, and it's highly specific with descriptors, with indicators that reference back to the criteria about each level of sophistication. Is it a 1, 2, 3, or 4 performance level? So just giving us a quick little grid here, picture you're building a course-specific rubric. You're probably going to have a minimum of 3 criteria. 2 we will certainly accept, but you probably want 3 because if you're doing a complex performance task, there are probably multiple levels. So we're going to reference frequently in this presentation the work of Grant Wiggins. He is a teacher researcher who's influenced many people's course design, and here's some things he says that a rubric should do. First of all, it ought to be rich and descriptive language. It ought to describe better and worse in very tangible qualitative terms. For example, this is a question you're asking on, like, say, the argument criterion of a writing rubric. What specifically makes this argument or proof better than the other one? And you want to really help kids see the discernible, useful, empirical differences in performance rather than just repetitive, comparative language from cell to cell of your rubric. Because why? We want the rubric to be educative. We want the assessment to be educative, and the rubric is a tool for that process. So one effective rubric you can take a look at after this presentation is over is a richly descriptive, holistic rubric that talks about the novice versus intermediate performances and superior performances of students who are showing Spanish proficiency. Now again, this is holistic and not analytic. We'll clarify that difference. In general, when you're building a rubric, you don't want it to be vague with unclear descriptors, too many adjectives. It should not be arbitrary. It should be rooted in what's considered valid criteria for your discipline. And it should not be all about checking off and getting points, or more about score than the actual qualitative standard or degree that you're looking for. So create a rubric that's quality driven. absolute standards driven, specific, like we said, and grounded in skill objectives. By now, you know the difference between macro and micro, and it should scaffold. Remember, we talked about that developmental sophistication from a 1 through a 4. There should be parallels among those cells, distinguishing 1, 2, 3, 4, and it should be in a larger context of formative feedback and students doing self-assessment. And obviously, it should speak to both your students and to you, all right? Something that's a tool that you all would reference. Now, here's the question. There are 2 types of rubrics. There's the holistic kind, the analytic trait rubric. You can do either. We prefer that in your individual course-specific rubrics, you are doing analytic trait rubrics for specific tasks that invite kids to practice and develop specific skills of your discipline. Both can work in the right context. Let's see how, but in particular, we're asking you for this exercise to do analytic trait rubrics, which we'll describe in a minute here. So holistic, well, you will complete a holistic rubric after week 7 of your course, and that's the e-study skills rubric. That's part of the performance evaluation that students complete. It's got general descriptors for performance as a whole. You have to pick a single score that's based on an overall impression for students. But here's the thing. It's founded on 7 weeks of data and feedback you've given based on your course-specific analytic rubrics. So day to day, the course-specific rubrics you build, they probably shouldn't be holistic because of the things I just said, how it's general, it's a single score based on an overall impression. Sure, it's simpler to use a holistic, it's more efficient for you, but it would compromise the validity, reliability, and the quality of the feedback you're giving to the kids, okay? Because analytic trait rubrics are much more specific, and they are also distinguishing among the traits. But before I get into that, let me just tell you like the problem with a holistic rubric. If you imagine that a kid could get a score of a 1 through 6, which many of you know advanced placement exams do, those are holistic rubrics. Well, a 1, which could be called an unpersuasive essay, could basically not really have any distinguishing criteria that distinguish why this kid got a 1 and another one got a 1. Let's say one paper is a mechanical mess. Grammar and spelling is all over the map, but the arguments are spot on. And then you've got another paper that also earns a 1, but it's beautifully, impeccably clear with the grammar and mechanics, but the superficial argumentation and the inaccurate facts make it unpersuasive. Well, the holistic rubric would give it the same score, and the kid wouldn't really know. What did I do? Okay? So how can I get better? So holistic rubrics are great at the end of things, after kids have been through a lot of more granular feedback on specific traits. Do pause the presentation to take a look at a holistic rubric for an oral presentation so you can see what Grant Wiggins means when he says, hey, if this is an oral presentation rubric, well, what should we do if a student makes great eye contact but fails to make a clear case for the importance of his or her subject in the speech he's making? The rubric would have us believe that making eye contact with the audience and arguing for the importance of a topic always go together. But logic and experience suggest otherwise. So we want you to go with analytic trait rubrics. Why? Because of the validity and the quality of the feedback demand we use that kind of scoring. By breaking out the traits of your assessment, it makes it more accurate, but it also actually teaches your students what you want for the desired results. And that should improve performance. So instead of the kid getting the weak feedback, they're going to get accurately specific feedback so they can do a more complete performance the next time. So analytic trait rubrics isolate each major trait of a performance task. For example, in a writing your essay rubric, there would be a criterion devoted to purpose and another one devoted to voice. And then how about in a science lab report rubric where there's an understanding of scientific method would be one criterion, and then there would be a precisions and calculations criterion, so they're not all merged together in one sort of messy, holistic bunch. And obviously, this is more explicit, clear, distinct, aptly weighted criteria inform those analytic trait rubrics. Now, if you want to have a few quick holistic ones, there's no problem with that. But in general, the 2 summative analytic trait rubrics you're doing, make them analytic trait ones. That's what we want. Some formative ones could be kind of holistic, but in general, always err on the side of analytic trait ones. But pace yourself. You cannot build a very detailed leveled rubric for every little task you do, especially not this year. Too prohibitive in time and energy to design a rubric for every task. That's a quote from Grant Wiggins. So you want to have a general set of analytic trait rubrics, which is why we're having you start with 2 summative assessments. You can take those criteria and then scaffold them through your course all 7 weeks using the outcomes tool in Canvas. So stay tuned for more information on that. So you want to focus on the key criteria related to key targets. So take a moment to look at the rest of this slide and think about the micro skills descriptors that you spent time analyzing. Those may shift as you actually have to build a rubric, but that will help you with this. Look at this slide and the next one. We've got an English language arts and a science example of how all that brainstorming you do for the macro and the micro skill objectives now can inform the success criteria and the standards of the rubrics you built. Pause the presentation, check these out. So Rigor, let's go back to that now. Now, Rigor is based on a number of things, but in particular, real-world roles of the discipline. How do the professionals in the discipline that you teach analyze, create, synthesize, and evaluate? All those higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. How can the performance task you're asking students to do mimic some of that and give them a chance to take a crack at that role? And if need be, at some point, if you can interview or if you have any professional experience with that role of the discipline, integrate the professional standards, modify them for the age group. See if experts in the field can help you judge some student work samples or just help you come up with the standards. For example, let's say you were building a short story rubric. Obviously, you want to have appropriate age level standards, but there should still be some communication of the highest level of the profession and measuring what authors, real authors, are expected to do. So these rubrics have to speak for themselves in a way that translates your class, okay? That's more than just the educative experience, but also what people are doing in the quote-unquote real world. So obviously, they want to stand alone to reflect the work of professionals. So here's an example. Pause the presentation and think about a great novel or short story you have read and compare it to this rubric. And think about plot, setting, and character in the context of this rubric. Now, this is for 5th, 6th, and 7th graders, but do you see how it echoes some of the standards of professional writers? How about this math problem-solving rubric? Likewise, and you can pause and look at this, think about what we want our engineers, our computer scientists, and all those people, physicists, who harness math to do. This math rubric is a rehearsal for later in life, but also teaching the important skill objectives for the discipline. Grant says that the rubric is a summary that generalizes from actual models in response to performance demand. Check out the other presentation we have about how you use models with students in conjunction with a rubric. The rubric is a quick reminder of what all the specific samples of work look like across a range of quality. So here are some steps for establishing your criteria. Start with grade level standards, start with the colleagues, Duke Tip staff helping you find some base level standards. Look at what the macro and micro skills for those objectives are. Ratchet up where you can for gifted youth, keeping in mind that if you hang out in the upper levels of Bloom's taxonomy, you're in a good place. Where possible, seek professionals' advice to mirror what's going on in the discipline, and use the models that students generate to refine and explicate these criteria. Revise yearly whenever you can in response to student models. Rubrics are always in process. Remember the 4 levels that we have as you're building rubrics, thinking about what gifted 8th and 9th graders can do. Don't forget Bloom's taxonomy. Sorry about the missing word in this presentation. But that's important that you're thinking about a difficult task that's complex and multifaceted. Is the cognitive demand high? Check out the audit matrix that Grant Wiggs and Norman Webb recommend. You don't want just basic knowledge recall and comprehension. You want creative problem solving to go on in these summative assessments. And just keep in mind this track analogy. If you had to do a pole vault event and they had actually made it absurdly low, the level that you had to clear, you would just be scratching your head going, why is this a track and field event? So we want to judge progress and performance relative to early jump heights and then look for appropriate growth. You can do that with your students in a 7-week term and grade them fairly by where they are at the end of the term. So develop your rubrics in ongoing conversation with us and colleagues, eventually with your students. Check out the next presentation that tells you how to do that, and use our collective wisdom to do that. Keep in mind you're not building a checklist. Take a moment to go over these slides and make sure the rubric you're building is not a checklist. That's a to-do list and what the activity checklist rubric is. Thank you for listening. You can take a moment to look at the next slides.